Hello and welcome to the Her Head in Films podcast. I'm your host. My name is Caitlin. In this podcast, I share my personal musings about cinema. If you're new to the podcast and you don't really know who I am, as I said, my name's Caitlin. I am a writer. I'm a dreamer. I'm 27 years old. I have a mad, furious, intense, obsessive passion for cinema and for films. And so this podcast is a place for me to just talk about the films that move me and astonish me and that I think are just really important and that have something to say. So I live in a rural area in the South in the United States. I'm not really surrounded by a lot of culture or a lot of cinephile culture. And so I really needed an outlet to talk about my feelings and my emotions about films. And so that's why I created this podcast. The name comes from an email that I sent a friend once, and I said that my head isn't in the clouds, my head is in films. And so I think that phrase, her head in films, is a perfect way to describe how I'm always thinking about films or how certain films haunt me. And so this podcast is very personal, it's very subjective, it's very raw, and those are all things that I want it to be and that I choose for it to be, because it really is just about one young woman's relationship to certain films, and that's what this podcast is. And so I hope that you will continue to listen, and if you're a returning listener, I really appreciate your listening to this. It's really wonderful. Today's episode is going to be about Sophie's Choice, a 1982 film by Alan J. Pakula. And I really want to talk about this film because it's a sort of a benchmark film in my life. It's one that I watched when I was a teenager. I also read the book by William Styron, the late William Styron. So when I was a teenager, I took a film appreciation class when I was in high school, and this was a class that introduced me to the idea that film could be art. And up to that point, I had seen film more as merely entertainment, as something that you just go to, you go to the theater. I enjoyed films, but I certainly didn't see them as art. And so this class was pretty pivotal. And I'm not sure if I saw Sophie's Choice before or after that class. It might have been after. But I would say this was probably about 2005, 2004. So probably around, definitely before 2010. So somewhere in the 2000s when I was a teenager and in high school, I came across Sophie's Choice, and I think I saw it probably on Turner Classic Movies or something like that. And I later got the DVD. And this was the time before Netflix, before Hulu, before Amazon even, really. And so the only way you were going to see films was through the television, or perhaps when you went out and bought a DVD. I actually still have that Sophie's Choice DVD. I don't have a DVD player right now. And I have a Chromebook which doesn't have a CD-ROM in it, so I can't even watch it on my computer. But I think I still have the DVD. And the DVD, I used to love getting them back in the day, because you would get all kinds of extra features. And this particular DVD had a documentary called Death Dreams of Mourning, and it was a short featurette that had interviews with Pakula, with Meryl Streep, with Kevin Kline, and William Styron. And so that was a really powerful thing for me. And as a child, I was very obsessed with the Holocaust, and I still am. But when I was around 9 or 10 years old, I read a book about Anne Frank, and I may have read her diary at that time too. So we're talking about 5th grade, really. I still remember when I was in that 5th grade class, and there was this book. It was a memoir that a friend, I think her name's Hannah Gosler, and she wrote a memoir about her friendship with Anne Frank when they were young. And so that was a moment that sort of catalyzed my obsession with the Holocaust. And so I tend to watch a lot of Holocaust films, and I tend to read a lot of Holocaust books throughout my life. I have, and I continue to, because it's it's just such a horrific moment in history, as all of you know. And so Sophie's Choice was part of that obsession. And I saw this film, and I've seen it many times, and it just obsessed me. And the book obsessed me. It's a huge book. I remember going to the Goodwill when I was younger, because I didn't have a lot of money. I grew up poor. I still struggle financially. I'm still working class pretty much. Never have, enough money for stuff. So I couldn't afford to go to Barnes and Noble or Borders or Books A Million to get new books, which would be like $14, $15 or more. So I always went to the local Goodwill, which is like a thrift store. And they would have this wall. I still remember the Goodwill that I went to. And they had this huge wall of books. And I was looking one day, and I had seen the Sophie's Choice film by then. And I found the book. It was this huge hardcover. It had like a tan color, very simple book jacket. And it was right there on the shelf, and I probably got it for like $1 or 75 cents or something. And I was like, well, I've got to read the book. And so I did. So when I talk about Sophie's Choice and my emotions about Sophie's Choice, it's very much connected to my childhood, to who I was as a young girl. When I look back at myself, I'm like, God, I was so strange. Here I was just this very intense, serious, dreamy girl, reading about the Holocaust, watching old films, watching Holocaust films, writing in my journal. I was a very serious person. I still am. So all my emotions about this film are tied to my youth and to my childhood. And I just had so many intense emotions about this story and about this film. So what is it about? And as I will say, with every episode, there will be spoilers, and I will talk about the ending. I will talk about what happens in the film and the book. So if you haven't seen the film, or you don't want it to be messed up for you or spoiled, then you might not want to listen to the complete episode. But Sophie's Choice has sort of entered our cultural language, right? Like, people will, if someone's having to make two decisions that are very difficult, they'll say, oh, it's like Sophie's Choice, which of course trivializes the horror of Sophie's Choice. I think some people say it without realizing what it's really about. And so I don't really particularly care for that phrase, but it has entered our lexicon as a country, I think. So Sophie's Choice, it started out as a book by William Styron. And in the film, it's about Sophie, who is a Polish Holocaust survivor. She was sent to Auschwitz, and she immigrates to the United States. So the film is set, there's really two portions of the film. The first part of the film is mainly set in post-war Brooklyn, New York. Maybe the late 1940s, I would say, when Sophie has immigrated there. She lives with her boyfriend Nathan, who is very charismatic, very lively, but also struggling with profound mental illness. With schizophrenia, he becomes very paranoid, very violent. He is brilliant, though. He's very intelligent, very full of life. He's just a wonder to behold. And Nathan's played by Kevin Kline. Sophie's played by Meryl Streep. And so the two of them live together in what's termed the Pink Palace, which is like a boarding house in Brooklyn, and it's pink. And it's actually really beautiful. It's this huge house. And a young man named Stingo comes to that boarding house. He is from the South, like I am, and he goes to Brooklyn, he has ambitions of being a writer, and so he's working on a book that hews very closely to his own life of losing his mother at a young age, And so he has huge ambitions to be, I guess, maybe the next great American writer. And so he meets Sophie and Nathan, who are already living in the Pink Palace together. The three of them form a very tight, I guess you could say, love triangle in a way, because Stingo is very much in love with Sophie. And then the first part of the film is 1940s Brooklyn, and then the second part of the film is when there are flashbacks to Auschwitz, which was a death camp and concentration camp in Poland, in Europe. It was Auschwitz, Birkenau. I'm not exactly sure what the proper pronunciation is. Birkenau, from what I know, was the death camp part. That's where people were gassed, and then their bodies were put in crematoriums, and they were turned to ash. And then there was a part of Auschwitz that was a work camp, and it was basically slave labor for people. So that is what Sophie has escaped. She did make a suicide attempt earlier before she got to Brooklyn, and they do show the scars on her wrists, and we also see the number on her forearm that was tattooed to indicate that she was a concentration camp survivor. So we really have two narratives going on in the film. We have a coming-of-age story with Stingo, the bright-eyed, optimistic, naive, innocent young writer who goes to Brooklyn to make something of himself. And then we have a Holocaust narrative about a woman who is profoundly traumatized and destroyed by her confrontation with death and with violence and with horror. And we have her relationship with Nathan that plays out. It's a very masochistic relationship. And what takes so long for us to learn is why she's with Nathan. Why is she in this violent, masochistic relationship? Nathan flies off the handle easily. He accuses her of cheating constantly. There are some more graphic instances in the book. In the book, he actually urinates on her. That's not in the film. From that documentary I was talking about, Death Dreams of Morning, I think Alan J. Pakula said that he just couldn't go there. He couldn't do the scene of the urination because I think he and also the actors, Kevin Kline and Meryl, I think they thought maybe it was just too degrading. Sophie and Nathan are so beautiful together. I think Meryl and Kevin Kline are just at their most sort of incandescent. They're young. They're probably in their 30s at that point, or their late 20s. I think Kevin Kline does an amazing job of bringing Nathan to life and how charismatic, and they really are like fatally, tragically glamorous. They like on the weekends, they'll dress up in like 1920s garb and just hang out and play the piano, and Stingo becomes enraptured by them. He sort of enters this world that Sophie and Nathan have created together. And of course, Sophie has created that world because she cannot live with what she did during World War II, during the Holocaust. The main thing that she did was that when she arrived at Auschwitz, when she arrived, and as many of us know, when you arrived on the cattle trains, sometimes there was Joseph Mengele. He's a very infamous doctor that would be on the ramp, and there were other doctors that would be on the ramp, and they would point left or they would point right, and that was your fate, and you either lived or you died. You either lived and went to work in the concentration camp, the work camp, or you were sent to the gas chambers immediately. If you were 16 or under, from what I understand, you would be sent to the gas chambers. Children rarely survived Auschwitz, rarely survived these death camps, because all they were really looking for was I guess, able-bodied adults. And the elderly were often gassed immediately, and children were gassed immediately, unless they served some larger purpose, say for the experiments of Joseph Mengele. So Sophie arrives with 2 children, with her son and with her daughter. And there's a particularly vicious Nazi on the ramp, and he says, I'll give you a choice. You can choose your son or you can choose your daughter. And in the horror of that moment, Sophie chooses her son, and she hands over her young daughter. The daughter's younger than the son, and she watches as her daughter is taken away from her. And Streep gives a really stunning performance. I'm going to talk more about her performance later in the podcast, but in this moment she really does this silent scream where her mouth is open but nothing's coming out. And she said in the interview in the documentary I saw that she didn't even realize she was doing that it really was this silent scream, and that it wasn't voluntary. It wasn't something she was choosing to do. It just sort of happened in the moment in which she was acting the scene. It sounds like a moment in which she just kind of let go and the performance took over. And so Sophie hates herself, I think, for what she did. She manages to get a job in Rudolf Höss's Rudolf Höss, or Hearst, oh god, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Rudolf was the commandant of Auschwitz, and he lived in the area, and she manages to get a job with him, and she barters. I mean, she does everything she can to save her son, to get information about her son, who was supposedly taken to the children's camp. We don't know where he was taken. He could have been killed immediately, just like the daughter was. She tries to get information. She tries to save him. She even tries to get him in the Lebensborn program, which was when, like, Polish children were, if they were blonde-haired and blue-eyed, they would be sent to Germany to be raised by German families. I guess something to do with, like, the Aryan, blood purity sort of thing that the Nazis were obsessed with. She does everything she can, really, to save her son, but none of it really works. And so it's she's with Nathan, the way I see it, because she cannot live with what she did. But of course, and we don't know if these incidents really happened. I don't know if in reality a woman was faced with this decision on the ramp at Auschwitz, where one of her children would be saved and one wouldn't. I don't know if it's based on a true account or not, but I think it stands in for some of the other difficult choices that people had to make in order to survive the Holocaust. You couldn't really be moral when you're in a death camp or a concentration camp. Think of this people who were part of the Sonderkommando, and recently a Hungarian film was made called Son of Saul that looks at a member of the Sonderkommando, and they were the people that, when people were gassed, they would go in and they would empty the gas chamber. They would empty the bodies from the gas chamber. They would take the bodies to the crematorium. This is at Auschwitz. And they would handle all that, I guess you could say, dirty work. But many of them were seen, I guess, as collaborators, or like they were colluding with the Nazis. I'm not sure why people have that view. I think those in the Sonderkommando were just trying to survive. They were just trying to get through it. They themselves were often Jews. And so they were having to do the death work, really, of the camps. And that's what the Nazis were brilliant at, is they were brilliant at seeming to give the Jewish people a choice just like with the Jewish councils that were set up in the ghettos across Europe. Those were headed by Jewish people, and the Nazis would come to them and say, you need to make a list of all the Jews that are going to be deported. Of course, at the time, they thought they were just going east. That was sort of the euphemism. They didn't know where people were being sent. They didn't know about the death camps. They didn't know they were sending them to their death. I'm sure at some point they did know. Once people were trying to escape the camps and were trying to get word out of what the Nazis were doing. So the Nazis were brilliant at basically making other Jewish people feel like they were murdering other Jewish people. Because, oh, you're in the Jewish council, so you're the one making the list. The Nazis are not making the list. And I think that's a particularly cruel and vicious form of violence that the Nazis came up with. They were incredibly creative in the ways in which they came up with these scenarios, but that seems particularly horrible. The Jews never had a choice, did they? They never had a choice. If they didn't make the list, well, they were killed, and then somebody else was going to make the list. It was not the Jews killing other Jews, it was the Nazis killing the Jews, right? I mean, but they were able to displace the blame, to say, oh, it wasn't us, it was your fellow Jewish people who were doing this to you, or whatever. And so I think Sophie's not Jewish. Sophie is incarcerated in Auschwitz. She tells Stingo that she stole a ham, but I can't remember if that's true, or I'm not sure how she ends up in Auschwitz, but she does with her children. So she thinks in that moment that she has a choice, but as Michael Berenbaum says, I think in the documentary Death Dreams of Mourning, or maybe it was another documentary that I saw him in which he said this, and he works for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, or did at one time. He said really what Sophie had was a choiceless choice. It was not a choice at all. And I think many Holocaust survivors, or Holocaust victims, people who died, they encountered choiceless choices at every turn. You know, how do you stay alive? How do you barter for your life? The difficult moral decisions that people had to make. Do I sell this person out? What do I do? Do I have sex with this guard? You know, there was violence, a lot of violence against women in the Holocaust, rape and sexual abuse. So I'm sure women that maybe had to sleep with some of these guards didn't feel great about themselves either. So what extent, what are you willing to do to survive? Because you're in the middle of horror. And but I don't think Sophie could live with it. And I think why I'm so obsessed with Sophie's Choice is I am obsessed with what trauma does to us. What trauma does to the body, to the soul. How do we survive horror, And obviously I've never been through anything remotely resembling the Holocaust. None of us have, right? We never will, hopefully, but this is a story for me about trauma, and it's about Sophie's trauma, and it's about how she hates herself. She lost her children. She has nothing. I mean, she is completely stripped bare. When she immigrates to Brooklyn, she is a bag of bones, a skin of bones. She's barely alive. She's barely surviving, and Nathan is her salvation. It's really also about how Sophie and Nathan save each other. Nathan feels a lot of guilt because he's Jewish, and he was in America. He could not fight the Nazis. He could not save other Jewish people in Europe. He felt helpless. He himself is very obsessed with the Holocaust. In their room in the Pink Palace, he has a room, I guess it's his office, and he has a lot of Nazi books, or books about Nazis and about the crimes of the Nazis. He's very obsessed with it. And so they are magnetized, they are seduced by each other because she gives him the intensity. I also wonder if it's like when you go through horror, when you go through something like that, the intensity of life is magnified. Think about people who come home from war and they talk about how it was so intense and it was so heightened, the way they lived, that it's hard for them to go back to a normal life, to just go to the grocery store, go to the park with their children. I wonder if there was some part of Sophie that Nathan was exciting, even though he was violent, even though he was painful to be with. He heightened her life. He put her in this constant state of not knowing what was going to happen. Life was unpredictable. Life was exciting, adventurous, and she didn't know what was going to happen next with Nathan. I wonder if a part of her needed that to keep going, and of course the masochism, the sadomasochism between the two of them, which, as I say, is much more pronounced in the book, I think. And I think it is a controversial part, especially of the book. I think she thought she deserved that. I think she felt so degraded and so ashamed of what she had done, of that choiceless choice on that ramp, that I don't think she felt like she deserved much. I really don't. Or maybe she needed that pain. I don't know. I'm not saying I have all the answers with this story, but it's just their relationship. The whole film is building towards the ending that happens, which is their suicide. Nathan and Sophie are found in bed together, dead, because I think they took like some kind of poison and died together. She can't live without him, and he's losing his mind. Literally, that's the second half of the film, is Nathan's unraveling, Nathan's complete breakdown from his mental illness, because he has schizophrenia. And she cannot live without him, and I don't think he can live without her. And they are absolutely, like I said, they saved each other. When she's first in Brooklyn, she collapses at a library, and that's how Nathan and her meet. And he cooks dinner for her. She has anemia, and he gives her anemia, iron-rich foods. They read Emily Dickinson together, because when she was at the library, she was looking for an Emily Dickinson book. They are very tender with each other at first, and I think she feels taken care of by him, and she feels safe with him. And they're just, like I said, they're like fatally glamorous, and that's what Stingo says, I think, at some point, or tragically, fatally glamorous, and they really were. But they were always, in a way, spiraling towards destruction and spiraling towards death. They saved each other only for so long, but then, of course, I think they just kind of merged together, and they couldn't live without each other. And I guess when I was a teenager, this story was just so entrancing. Like, I think when you're a teenager, you're so intense, and your emotions are very heightened, and so when you come across stories like this about love and pain and trauma and horror, and of course these lovers who are intensely in love with each other and kill themselves together like Romeo and Juliet, sort of, it's very appealing, I think, to a teenager. But I rewatched the film recently, just maybe about a month ago, and it was on Filmstruck, the website Filmstruck, and I rewatched it, and I still thought it was just as powerful as when I saw it when I was younger and in my teens. I probably am seeing it sort of a decade apart, and I still thought that it had a lot of power about it, and a lot of beauty. And so I think Sophie and Nathan, I haven't talked much about Stingo, but he's inexperienced, he's innocent, he's naive, and he just falls head over heels in love with both of them, with Nathan and Stingo. And like I said, it becomes like this love triangle. and he becomes obsessed with them. And I really loved this aspect of the film as well, and that was the relationship that Stingo has with Sophie and Nathan, and how I really loved the friendship between them. I'm someone who has been very lonely much of my life, and I haven't had a lot of friends. And so sometimes when I watch films about people who have these really intense friendships and who just have this really deep connection to one another, I find that so fascinating, because it's not something that I've ever experienced myself. And so you have a movie about friendship, I thought, about Stingo, Nathan, and Sophie, and who they are together. But of course, Stingo has to go on, and when he meets Nathan and Sophie, they bring death into his life. They bring horror into his life. He's this kid I think he's from Virginia, and I grew up in North Carolina, and Virginia's right above North Carolina, and he's just this little southern boy, you know what I mean? And he doesn't have any experience with this. And so it's a loss of innocence, I think, for him. He meets them and they completely change his life. And of course, he, as the writer, has to go on to tell the story. And he has to be a witness to Sophie and Nathan, to the horror that Sophie endured. And he is the one to tell that story. And so it's really about a writer finding his voice. It's about a writer discovering life and losing his innocence. And I think it's an interesting movie for writers to watch, you know, because it really is. It's about literature. Sophie and Nathan love literature. They love Walt Whitman. They love Hart Crane. They love Emily Dickinson. And there's actually this wonderful scene on Brooklyn Bridge. Oh my God, ever since then, I have been in love with the Brooklyn Bridge because of this film, and would love to experience it one day, maybe. Where he toasts to Stingo. He's read Stingo's novel that Stingo's writing, and he does this toast to Stingo on the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's this moment of anointing. And Stingo, it's just, you can tell Stingo just feels so happy and alive. And that's the way Sophie and Nathan made him feel. But they also brought a lot of death and horror into his life that he has to live with and that he has to bear, in a way. I just want to talk a little bit about Streep's performance. Meryl Streep, she did win an Oscar for her performance in this film. I do consider it one of the greatest acting performances in the history of cinema. I cannot overstate how important her performance is and how amazing it is. She lost weight for the flashbacks in Auschwitz when she was very thin. She wore false teeth when she was playing Sophie as an immigrant in Brooklyn. I think her and Pakula, I guess, thought that maybe because of the malnutrition that Sophie had suffered, that maybe her teeth would be affected by it. And so throughout the film, at least like in the second portion where she's an immigrant in Brooklyn, she has false teeth on, and you can tell that they're false teeth. Meryl Streep also took extensive classes in Polish and German. She may have been fluent. I can't say for sure, but she did take classes in both languages. So this was an immersive performance for Streep, and I think that she completely embodied Sophie. And so I think when I became obsessed with the film, and I still am, her performance is key to it. The way she embodied the trauma that Sophie endured. I mean, during the Auschwitz flashbacks, her hair is shaved, her hair is chopped off. She's very thin. She's not worried about being pretty or glamorous. This is about, as naturalistically and realistically as possible, about portraying the experience of the death camps. So I can't overstate Streep's performance, and I really think it is one of the greatest in cinema history. And rewatching it recently, I was just I was just as stunned. And it's not only in the big moments, like the choice scene on the ramp at Auschwitz. It's not just that with the silent scream. It's the whole film, because a lot of this film is about Sophie telling her story. It's about Sophie sitting, like there's this one scene where she's talking about Auschwitz, or she's talking about her life in Poland, and Streep is sitting at a window. And when I watched the documentary Death Dreams of Morning, I want to say that Pakula said that, or Pakula, sorry, that he actually filmed her from far away. She's looking through a window, and he films her looking through the window, and her face is through the glass. And I think Streep said something like, I wish I could remember, but she said something like that what she was saying was so horrific that the memories she was trying to conjure as an actress were so inflammatory and devastating that she almost needed that space. She almost needed for the camera not to be like right there in her face as she's trying to relive these images and this story. And so he filmed her from far away through the window, through the glass. And you absolutely believe that she is telling this story, telling about her life in Poland and about her life, in Auschwitz. You absolutely believe that in this moment, this woman is truly remembering these things. It's just, I think we forget that cinema is really so much about actors and about actors' faces and about how actors embody and perform emotion and the human experience and the human condition. And it's still like, when you see a great actor, there's still nothing like it. There's still nothing like it. And seeing her performance again made me think of other performances that I think are amazing, like Gina Rollins in A Woman Under the Influence, or Isabel Huppert in The Piano Teacher, or Nicole Kidman in Birth by Jonathan Glazer, or Marion Cotillard in La Vie en Rose. These are just a few touchstones for me that I think are really great performances. And Streep just had it, and she just said that it was so difficult doing those scenes. And then there's also a scene at the end where she's with Stingo, and this is when she actually talks about what she did, because Stingo is saying, I want to take you to my farm in Virginia, and I want us to get married, and I want us to have children. And she says, your children deserve a better mother. And then she tells him that she had to choose between her children. And in the documentary I saw, if I'm remembering correctly, it's a scene in which Sophie is supposed to have been drinking. And I think Streep was actually drunk in that scene. And she said that she was sort of inebriated, and that she sort of didn't like that she didn't think that her performance was good enough because she was inebriated and she was intoxicated and she didn't have as much control over it. But I think it maybe gives it a bit of authenticity, where you feel like, she really is maybe drunk and trying to talk about this experience. It's a devastating moment. And that's when you see like the true self-hatred that Sophie has for herself, that she doesn't think she deserves to be a mother again. She doesn't think that she can do that because of what the Nazis did to her in Auschwitz and made her choose between her children. That trauma just doesn't just evaporate. It doesn't just go away. It lives on in myriad ways. And finally, I just want to talk a bit about the depiction of the Holocaust in the film. An important part of the film is that when there's the Auschwitz flashbacks, they chose to change the colors. So Pakula and the cinematographer used like a different lens, and the colors of Auschwitz and of even Poland are very gray and brown and sort of like muted, very different from the more colorful, vibrant colors of Brooklyn. So that was a very pointed decision and precise decision by the filmmakers to change the color when she's going into the past. It's a very muddy, sort of a muddy palette, I would say. Very muted, very lifeless in a way, that sort of color, and it works very well. It sort of evokes, I think, the drudgery and the horror of Auschwitz. There was a technical advisor on the film, or a consultant, Kitty Hart-Moxon, who's still alive, and she herself was a Holocaust survivor and was imprisoned at Auschwitz for several years, and so she was a consultant on the film to give it that authentic feel, to make sure that things that were being shown on the screen were accurate. And there's this scene where Sophie, Meryl Streep's character, is walking through Auschwitz. It's just this field of mud, and I think it's past the gas chambers, possibly. And the hands are sticking out of the windows, like, it's sort of haunting. And Kitty was the one, I think, who told them that what you would do is that when you had to walk through the mud like that, what you would do is you would try to step in the footprints that other people had left behind in the mud. And so that's what Streep was doing as she walks through the mud. She's trying to step into other people's footprints. And so that's like a little bit of a detail that's very, that's sort of accurate, and really speaks to, I think, the verisimilitude of the film and how they tried, I think, to get as accurate a depiction of Auschwitz and the Holocaust as they could. And I mean, I know there are people that don't like the film. There are people that say it's too long, or it's too convoluted. There's too much going on. You know, you've got Stingo, and you've got you seem to have several different narratives. Like I said before, you really have a coming-of-age narrative mixed with a Holocaust narrative. But I personally think that all of that is necessary. I think every scene in the film is necessary to tell the story. Because this is a film about the Holocaust, but I think more than that, it's about life after the Holocaust, or life after a trauma. It's about how do you keep living, and what if you can't keep living? What if you've been through something so horrific that you can't keep living? And when it comes to the Holocaust, especially in American culture, which I find really obnoxious, is the tendency to want to focus on the hopeful narrative, on the overcoming triumph narrative. And we see that with Anne Frank a lot, that everyone quotes the really positive viewpoints that Anne Frank wrote about. Well, I think it's disingenuous, and I think it's inauthentic, because we don't know what she would have written. She was writing that when she was in the annex. That little girl, that teenage girl, and I love Anne Frank, she was sent to Auschwitz, and then she was sent to Bergen-Belsen. At the end of her life, after her mother was dead, after her sister was dead, Anne Frank was roaming the grounds of Bergen-Belsen in a flea-encrusted blanket. She was naked and covered in a blanket, asking people for food. She was put through unimaginable horror. So when you only quote the positive parts of that diary, you absolutely do an injustice to her memory and her life, because we have no idea what she would have written otherwise about the horror that she experienced. Yes, life in hiding was hard and it was difficult, but it was nothing like being taken to concentration camps, in cattle cars, and being put through selection, and being put through hard labor, and losing your mother, and losing your sister, and getting typhus, and roaming around naked in a blanket. I have no patience or tolerance for people that want to make Anne Frank into this happy-go-lucky schoolgirl. It's a complete just fabrication to me. And so we want to talk about the survivors who did really well, and I'm happy for the survivors that could go on and had a family and could live, and it's amazing. It's astounding the way people can survive horror and how they can go on with their lives. But I do think there is a story that is not told, and that's the story of the survivors who struggled, the survivors who did commit suicide. I mean, there's still questions about Primo Levi Primo Levi, and whether he committed suicide. It seems, possible that he did. But we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about the survivors or people that commit suicide in general, who maybe went through really horrific things and really struggled to go on with life, who are forever changed by it. And so what I think I found in Sophie, and I continue to find in Sophie, is the story of a woman who can't be okay again, a woman who can't cope, a woman who can't bear what she saw and what she did and what she endured. And she does end up dying. Her and Nathan take their lives at the end, and Stingo comes and sees their bodies, and he knows that he has to go on and that he has to tell that story. Sophie was a victim of the Nazis. She was a victim of the Holocaust. And I think her voice matters, and, I don't know what Anne Frank would have done if she had survived, that kind of trauma and what she went through, how she would have written about it. If she could have ever written one word again. She was 16. She was the age I was when I lost my father. You go through these traumas and they change you forever. And so Sophie is an example of that, and she's an important example of that. And like I said, it's about the Holocaust, but it's about how do you then go on living after that kind of degradation, that kind of violence that's inflicted on your body, your soul, your mind. And I'd like to see more films and books about that. Films and books that are not about the triumphant spirit, but are about like the real grinding, day in, day out work that it takes to survive and to keep living. And what happens when you get to a point when you can't keep living, when you've lost too much and you've gone through too much and you just can't do it anymore. I think that's a valid story, a valid narrative to talk about. But that is my episode about Sophie's Choice. I hope it has value. I hope that you learned something new, or that you just maybe look at the film in a different way, or will maybe go seek out the film. It's still a really important film to me, and one that I really love. I love the film. I do think it's a great film, and I mean, a lot of people disagree with that. I've seen a lot of reviews of it that are not kind at all, but I hope that I've made my case for this film and why I think that it is really, really good. I will stop here. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Bye for now.